The following is an AZPM original production.
Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, making school meals healthier. A new bill in the Arizona legislature could result in the meals served in our public schools getting healthier. The bill would ban foods that contain 11 ingredients from the meals schools serve, saying those ingredients are most frequently put into ultraprocessed foods and can have a detrimental effect on the eater's health. To hear more about the bill and the ingredients it singles out, we spoke with its sponsor, Republican State Representative Leo Biasucci. I started our conversation by asking him why he introduced the bill now when health experts have warned of these chemicals for years.
It's something I've always been looking into. I've also involved in nutrition and just kind of been reading labels probably the last 10 years. But it's really, I think, since the RFK Jr. kind of came into the spotlight as a Republican under this administration, is when it finally, for me, it was saying, like, finally we have somebody that's willing to speak on the national level, because this is something I've been, you kind of talk about and people, don't really pay attention, or I don't know if they don't care. But what started this all is my family is from Italy. And so I was actually, when I was there, I was looking at a lot of their food items that they have and they provide, and it didn't have, nearly 90% of the things that we have in ours. So I'm looking at the label of, even a Powerade, the same company that's making this product, and I'm noticing that they don't have the blue 4, red 40, or whatever it is. And then I started to research and to realize a lot of these items are banned in a lot of other countries and not in ours. And that's really where it kind of like piqued my interest on, okay, wait a minute, what's happening here where, all these items are banned in these other countries, but we're still allowing it in the US. I say it all the time where I can't blame my parents for what they fed me because they just didn't know 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now the data is finally coming out, the scientific research is coming out, that we're realizing, okay, maybe this is not good for our children.
The bill deals specifically with public schools. Does that include charter schools? And for people who may question, why not include private schools and parochial schools and others?
Yeah, so my goal is any school that's going to take any dollars from the federal government or any kind of dollars to supplement their food program. I think this is like a good step for me. Like, and if you look at the list, even, I had some people come to me and say, well, there's a lot more things that are, toxic in our foods. But I also understand the legislature and I understand the process down here and how sometimes you can't get, too crazy with your bills. You have to make sure you get your foot in the door. And so this is kind of a good first step. And then hopefully this will expand to, doing things like California took it to a whole nother level, which I hope we can get to at some point.
Now, you just said something that may have made some people listening to this possibly drive off the road. You said California did something good.
I know.
That's not something we hear Republicans say a lot.
You're right. And I said there's a lot of things, especially now, that are not being done well. But I got to give credit where credit's due. So they actually just recently banned not only in their school lunches, but even in regular foods. They're banning. Going through the list, I know almost all of them that are on my list. So yellow dye 5, yellow 6, school lunches, blue 1, blue 2. I got to give them credit. I mean, they've taken the step in the right direction, and it's exciting to see them that they've really took it upon themselves to be one of the first states to do it, if not the first. I haven't researched it completely, but it's exciting.
Some of the things you just mentioned are dyes, and 7 of the 11 specifics you mention in the bill are dyes.
Right.
Is it the dyes in particular that are the problem, or is it food that's being dyed probably is a problem?
Yeah, I mean, so I know for sure a lot of these dyes have the data themselves. So like the red 40 I know is being tied to things like ADHD. And it's funny. So you go to Europe and you see a product. It might even be the same company. I'll give an example. Like I said, like let's just say a Powerade. Since it's banned, they're using a vegetable color instead of a red dye. That's a synthetic option. And so I think the scientific data is showing that these dyes are really a problem. And it even goes beyond that. And you'll see there's other additives, titanium dioxide, and some other things that the data is now there to show, okay, these are specific items that are really causing problems. Here are countries that have already banned it. And so this is why my list, I wanted to make sure when it was drawn up that the data exists. I don't want to just be throwing things on a list that may or may not have problems or may not have scientific data to prove it. But these are the ones that I know the data is there. I know other countries have banned them. And that's my goal in committees, to make sure I bring in the right people, the right specialists, the people that know more than I do, to explain why.
Talking about the bans, all of this stuff right now is legal in the U.S., approved by the Food and Drug Administration. But as you and I have said, you've been reading labels. A lot of people have been reading labels for years and years and years. The FDA across multiple administrations has not gotten on board on this.
Right.
Did they miss the mark, and are food companies just putting profits over your health, my health, kids' health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a question that I think we all deserve an answer to. It doesn't make sense to me when you have all these other countries that are banning these products, and here we are in the U.S. and we're one of the only ones that still have it. When we're supposed to, be one of the, obviously, I believe we're the greatest country in the world, and we should have the people in positions to make sure we're not providing our children, especially, with these toxic ingredients. So the question becomes, why is that? Is it because the industry has just been able to do what they need to do to convince people, the FDA and whatnot, that these aren't problems? But you kind of go back to previous stuff, like with cigarettes. I mean, how long did it take for people to finally come to the conclusion that, okay, these are not healthy for people? But it took a long time, because you have a great lobbying group, you have great, you have people that are pushing back, and they're going to fight back. And I'm sure it's going to happen here as well. You're going to have people come back and say it's not necessary to do this. I mean, and I don't know if it has to do with cost. I think we all know when you go to buy an organic item versus one that's been processed and has all these additives, substantially higher. So maybe that's the reason. That's something that I hope we get to the bottom to.
You mentioned things like organic foods tend to be more expensive. Processed foods are cheap.
Right.
School budgets are tight.
Right.
There's nothing in this bill, because it's not a budget bill, to help schools with that, but we could be increasing school budgets. It might take more people to not just reheat frozen things. Is there any financial mechanism for this bill down the road?
Yeah. So the great news is, when I did the research, one of the top things, right? Because when you look at the products itself, and the data shows how bad they are, I think everybody's going to agree. Like, we need to take these things out of our school lunches, primarily first, because these are our children. We want to make sure they're obviously not ingesting this stuff. But the number one argument is always going to be money. My initial pushback is going to be, we're okay to send how many billions of dollars overseas. I think, right or wrong, I think Ukraine, we've sent 150 billion, with a B, over the last couple of years. So right away, I'm going to push back and say I think it's more important, or equally important at least, to make sure that we're investing in our children's health. There is a program called Try It Local. It came out during COVID. I have to I'm not sure if it was during the Trump administration or Biden administration. These dollar amounts were actually, Arizona has utilized about 4 million of it. And the whole purpose of this Try It Local was for schools to buy local, less processed items from their local markets. So a program already exists. And this is going to be my number one ask when I have the opportunity to speak to RFK Jr. in the Trump administration is, look, let's put more money towards this program so that we don't have to worry about the financial side. Because I don't think there should ever be a cap on how much money we spend to make sure our children are getting the right food, the proper nutrition, and we're not poisoning them. And it's not about so much banning as much as it is, if a school is making pizza for their students, which the last thing I want to do is ban pizza from schools, because first, being Italian, that would be probably a sin in itself. But kids love pizza. But the good news is when I speak to my school districts, they're telling me, look, we make it from scratch. So that excites me, because then I know, okay, if we're making it from scratch, if they're making it from scratch, they can buy the dough that doesn't have these items. They can buy the sauce that doesn't have these items.
As we wrap this up, you've mentioned working with RFK Jr., working with the new administration, going to Washington. It sounds like there's going to have to be a lot of partnership in this. I know when I was a kid, and granted that was back in the Stone Ages, and one of the things my mom always complained about is that the federal government at the time considered for school lunches ketchup a vegetable. Now, for me, that worked out really well.
Right.
But maybe not so much for my health as a kid. It sounds like this really at the end of the day, this is going to come down to the federal government. It's going to be more the states applying the pressure, you applying the pressure to RFK Jr. And the federal government to really pick this up.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, and the reason for that is because these are where the dollars are coming from. And the dollars are coming from the feds for our school lunch programs. And so it is going to be a very big partnership between the federal government and the states. It's a reason why I even love the Try It Local program, because it's kind of, the federal government might have their guidelines, but they're giving it back to the states to say, look, you should be finding local foods and farmers markets and utilizing those when you can. And here are the dollars to do that. So it's kind of just really a shift. Like you said, when you were a kid, and I was the same way, I look back and think about the pizza that I was being served, or the kind of foods. I mean, I don't even know if it was a living organism, or I can't even. I think about like how bad it looked and how just reheated and this and that. So I think we've come a long way already. But you're right. I mean, this has got to be just a shift in just our society on, look, it's time to do the right thing. And it's time to make sure the one part of our population that is most important, that we're taking care of them. Because, they don't know what they don't know. And it's up to us as adults to say, now we have the information. Let's make sure our children are getting the nutritious food that they deserve.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time to explain all this to us.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
That was Arizona State Representative Leo Biasucci. We have to note that after we talked with Representative Biasucci and other topic experts for this show, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced it is banning red dye number 3. That's on the list of chemicals in the bill. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, we ask health and school lunch experts about that bill. Stay with us.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're looking at a bill that would ban ultra-processed foods from school-served meals this week. For an expert opinion on the 11 chemicals the bill would ban, we now turn to Dr. Melanie Hengel. She's the Associate Director of the School of Nutritional Sciences and Wellness at the University of Arizona. I started by asking her if ultra-processed foods are as bad for our health as many say.
Yes and no. And I'll explain why. Nutrition science is always changing and our evidence is always accumulating, and we look at things in new ways using new methods. But fundamentally, I think although they have been around a while, ultra-processed foods, we have known for quite some time they're not great for our health. But the evidence suggests, and we've looked at this through many different lenses in nutrition science, including lots of reviews of studies. So where they got a bunch of studies and looked at them, and they looked at something called a meta-analysis, where they pool all the results of all the studies and look at the effects or relationships with human health. So we know that lots of ultra-processed food in your diet is associated with greater risk of metabolic disease, of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, for instance, and of overweight obesity.
Maybe we need to have some definitions, because I remember growing up hearing about processed foods. Now we're hearing about ultra-processed foods. What's the difference, or have we just rebranded them, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, there is a difference, at least from a nutrition science standpoint, maybe not so much from a consumer standpoint, although that will change too, I think, with new labeling coming into effect. So a processed food generally is just something that's undergone some kind of transformation. Could be mechanical, things being cut up. It could be chemical, where you're having like a process like fermentation happen, or things added to it. And so since it was so general of a term, processed, nutrition scientists and others wanted to distinguish between just what happens to food when it's being packaged up and sent out to us to get to us, versus some things have been added to it and has been changed substantively in a way that maybe isn't so good for health. So those ultra-processed foods are different than just sort of your regular chopping, cutting, cleaning, getting ready for market, in that they have things added to them.
So when it comes to processed into ultra ultra-processed. Are there degrees of ultra-processed? And I'm sure at the far end of ultra-processed is many people's favorites, hot dogs and things like that. And because we really don't know what's in those.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. But are there degrees of it?
Yeah, maybe not of ultra-processed, but certainly if you think of maybe the corollary, so no processing, unprocessed or minimally processed foods are those that closely resemble where they came from, like from an animal or plant. So you would recognize them. So for example, an apple, if you just eat it on its own, it came off a tree, that is unprocessed as it gets. You could have a minimally processed apple, which would be slices of apple, because a piece of it has been taken away, like the seeds or the core that people don't usually eat. And then there would be, maybe moving into that same example, ultra-processed would be applesauce with added sugar. So there are different sort of degrees of this, but generally ultra-processed means things have been added to it, whereas just minimally processed, unprocessed, nothing's been added, only subtracted.
So the bill the legislature's looking at has a list of ingredients that they're trying to get out of school lunches. Mm-hmm. How's that list doing? Good list, bad list, somewhere in between?
I think it's very in line with our health concerns overall, which are, of course, we want to prevent chronic disease, especially cancer, especially metabolic disease, which is there's a very high prevalence of here in the United States. The list I saw, the additives are really related to making food a certain color or preserving it. And none of those things are critical to human health. In fact, some of them are harmful. And the FDA has expressed concern about these. We've actually taken steps in the U.S. government and FDA recently to explicitly ban or otherwise label these things. So I think that's a great start. It doesn't get into added sugars and fats and some other maybe nutrients of concern or ones that we want to moderate, but school lunch has those standards. And so I think maybe that's some of the rationale of just sort of focusing on the colors and additives that we really don't need for our health.
Some of the things on this list have been banned in places like Europe for years. The FDA has allowed them to be in our foods, be it school lunches or your lunch and my lunch or dinner or whatever. Why are we behind, and have we seen a health difference in places like Europe that have had these bans?
Yeah, great. This is a great question. I think Europe has been ahead of us in a lot of ways, and other parts of the world, not just Europe, in tackling this idea of ultra-processed foods. And some of it's related to how we distribute food, who lobbies. I think that's a big influence here. Who lobbies on behalf of our food production companies is a very strong lobby in the United States on that. We've been sort of rejecting legislation that is viewed as overly regulating those things and people's choices, for instance, right? So I think we've been erring on that side more than sort of the safety health because of, again, not a lack of evidence per se, but just sort of people's preferences for having this wide range of products available to them. I hope this moves us more toward the healthier choices. I see labeling and I see these types of bills as being more guardrails. They're not restricting people's choices. They're simply saying these things really are not contributing to our health at all. And to just have them taken away is not going to impact the product. Maybe it'll change a little bit of how it might look. But again, overall, it will be the same thing fundamentally. It just might not quite last as long as you're in your pantry or have that bright red color that some of those foods have.
So if we were to dub you for a moment the Zar of Healthy Eating, what do we as Americans need to be aware of when we're going down the aisles of the grocery store or preparing meals for ourselves or our family, maybe even out, to dinner or lunch or breakfast?
Oh, I like this thought experiment. I would say that number one thing you can do is, I love the idea of focusing on more unprocessed and minimally processed food. So if you are shopping at the grocery store, choosing your food, look around the grocery store and look for those foods that look familiar just by staring at them. You know what they are. They come from the tree. They come from animals that you recognize. They don't have a lot of things added to them. You can then take that to the aisles of the grocery store as well and look at packaged foods, and the fewer ingredients those foods have, generally the less processed they are. They have fewer additives. And again, all those things on that list that the Arizona bill has, those should not be in your food if at all possible. So all the additives and preservatives and emulsifiers and thickeners, those are all extra things to make our food attractive, but they're not necessary for either the taste or the health of it. So I think that's a great start. Also, the label doesn't tell the whole story. Always consulting with a nutrition person or just becoming generally aware of what are healthier choices. We have some dietary guidelines out there. Actually, a new version just came out to the public. So all the things you might suspect, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lean proteins, these are the things that are really important to be eating most of the time.
All the things Mom told me all
That's
those
right.
years. I guess I should listen to her.
She was right. She was right.
Well, thanks for spending a little time with us.
My pleasure.
That was nutritionist Dr. Melanie Hengel. We wrap up this episode with someone whose work this bill would affect directly. Lindsay Aguilar is the Food Services Director for the Tucson Unified School District. She starts by telling us how TUSD gets its food.
We operate the federal child nutrition programs. So that's the school breakfast program, the national school lunch program, the after school supper meal program, and then of course we have the summer food service program as well. So as far as where those meals come from, at TUSD we have a food services department that leads and implements those programs across all 87 of our schools and in the community. We do Boys and Girls Club supper meals. In the summertime we partner with Tucson Parks and Rec and other community locations to continue feeding children in our community during the summertime. But the food, we have formal procurement processes that we have to abide by, which are very complex and very regulated. So we have bids for our foods that we kind of break up into categories. The process of getting foods on our actual menu at TUSD, we have an administrative team of dietitians, nutrition coordinators, chefs, culinary backgrounds, hospitality industry, you name it. A lot of professionals on our team that review all of these products. So we're looking at ingredients, labels, what's in the food. We're looking at where it comes from. There is actually a component of the National School Lunch Program called Buy American, where we actually have regulation of foods that need to be purchased domestic. And if they're not available domestic or price points would lead us, you take bananas. Those are not a domestic item. So bananas have to come from somewhere else. But there's actual processes that we have to go through in terms of where the food comes from, where it's produced. Labels, nutrition facts, nutritional information is a huge component. So we're looking at not just the meal pattern requirements that are regulated for this federal program, calories, all of the macronutrients, sodium, all the how it's going to come together to meet our requirements for the menu. We're also looking at vendors and manufacturers.
How many meals, I guess, a day on an average day is TUSD serving?
So currently we're serving about just over 7,000 breakfasts a day and around 30,000 lunches a day.
You mentioned federal requirements. I remember growing up as a kid, my mom talking about, this is federally required, that there be certain fruits or vegetables or what is a fruit or a vegetable and things like that. How strict are those requirements that you all have to deal with?
It's broken down into what's called a meal pattern. So essentially a school lunch in the United States, the requirements are a minimum of, comes out to about 2 ounces of protein, 2 ounces of whole grain. We have to offer 1 cup of fruit and 1 cup of vegetable with a student taking a half cup minimum portion. And then of course the 8 ounces of fluid milk. So that meal has to then meet certain calorie levels. There's thresholds, ranges, depending on the grade level. So it's broken down, obviously elementary, middle, high. Students have different nutritional needs. So obviously high school, the portions are going to be more calories than a kindergarten student. And then within that meal pattern, it's broken down even further with, no trans fat. There's limits on saturated fat. I already mentioned the ranges of calories, sodium restrictions coming soon with the most recent nutritional standards standards that will be implemented in the coming years. There's now added sugar standards that we have to implement, and there's also subgroups of vegetables.
So does the lettuce on my sandwich count as a vegetable?
Not if it's a iceberg. It has to be, for example, romaine or a dark green leaf. A iceberg does not count as a dark green vegetable, and we don't use iceberg lettuce in our program here at TUSD because it doesn't have much nutritional value.
So you mentioned a minute ago changes to the requirements, sodium trans fats, added sugars. This bill that's been proposed in the legislature deals with a lot of more chemical additives and dyes and things like that. If this were to pass, and it sounds like changes are made from the federal level on a fairly regular basis, how difficult is it to implement those kinds of changes?
So whenever there's regulatory changes or at the state and local level, often if it's not a federal requirement, that can create some challenges for local operators in terms of being able to find products that perhaps, have these specific requirements. But I can also say that over the last decade, with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act being changes that were implemented and over the course updated standards, then manufacturers have really done a tremendous job of really, looking at ingredients and labels and taking, things out that, I'm a registered dietitian. A lot of school district operators are or have culinary nutrition backgrounds, looking at products for schools that, have more clean labels, things that, we always say if you can't pronounce, the the words on a label, that could be a red flag, right? So, and there are a lot of initiatives, around the country or local districts that are really, doing things to identify those things, or even have their own kind of internal processes in terms of what they're looking for, communicating to the manufacturers or vendors. And a lot of times, as things become, state legislative changes or possibly even federal, then obviously, manufacturers definitely start to, review those types of changes that are needed in our food system.
All right. Well, thanks for explaining all this to us.
Absolutely. Happy to.
That was Tucson Unified School District Food Services Director Lindsay Aguilar. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Maggie Farmer. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
Like this podcast? Your support makes AZPM original productions like this one possible. Donate at azpm.org/give.